watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
Welcome to this week's Roundtable. As we look at some of the major issues of concern today, I'm extremely pleased to be joined by four thoughtful individuals in the Jewish community today. I want to introduce them to you. Micah Halpern frequently appears as an analyst on various television and radio networks in the areas of terrorism, the Middle East, and Muslim fundamentalism. And Micah is the author of the best-selling book about despots entitled Thugs. Ellie Cohanim is Vice President for Development at the Center for Initiatives in Jewish Education and has done similar work for the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, for Yeshiva University's Stern College, and for UGA Federation of New York. Daniel Perez is Managing Editor of The Jewish Voice, a weekly newspaper serving New York, New Jersey, and South Florida. He's also an op-ed columnist for Israel National News. And Lynda Kraar, president of Lynda Kraar and Associates, is a consultant who specializes in the nonprofit sector with a long history of working on behalf of Jewish and Israeli causes. And she's worked with the late General Uzi Narkis, a World Zionist, at the World Zionist Organization, with the Jewish Agency, with the Council of Jewish Federations, and with many local and national Jewish agencies. And of course, Lynda was partner with one of American Jewry's most dynamic and creative Jewish leaders, the late Marty Kraar, who many of you may have known through his leadership of the Jewish Federation movement throughout America, and from seeing him sitting at this round table. And we miss Marty very much. And Lynda, it's wonderful to have you sitting with me. Thank you, darling. And thank all of you for joining me. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
Micah, as always, I want to start with you. So lo and behold, if one is looking at American television these days, reading the newspapers, it seems like the number one question is, did President Obama and the American administration make a mistake when it apologized for what seems to have been a confusing burning of the Koran? And I say confusing, Micah, because I'm fascinated to hear what you will say. You understand the story to be. I've seen two different stories. One, the Korans were being used to sort of communicate jihadist messages, and this provoked the ire of some American authorities who then had these Korans burned. And I've also heard CBS reports and other reports that it was inadvertent and an accident, and therefore the president felt he should send an emissary to a major mosque here in America to express the American government's apologies. And then, of course, we had a reaction in Afghanistan where Americans were murdered. But the real question is, when the president sent somebody to apologize for this burning of the Koran, did he make a mistake or not?
It is not the president's role to actually weigh in on this. It's not for him to do. At most, a Secretary of the Air Force should have been involved. At most. If not that, maybe the Joint Chiefs should have said something.
Well, it was a Pentagon official, Peter Lavoie, who actually made the apology.
But he was sent on behalf and had and the president's name and the spokesperson of the president actually spoke about it also in the briefing.
Correct.
And so the president weighed in on this. And they should not have weighed in on this.
Why
He should
not?
have been invited because it's a minor issue within foreign policy. It's not a major issue. These things happen all the time. People get insulted all the time now. Do things ultimately go into riots and stuff like that? That's a different story. That's what happens in Afghanistan. We've got to realize that.
I don't hear yet your answer whether the president made a mistake. What I heard you say was it was unnecessary for him to make any comment.
Well, I'll use words like unwise. as opposed to mistake. It was unwise to move ahead in this vein, period.
What was your stand? Did the president make a mistake, or was he correct to apologize?
You know, I'd have to say, I also would agree. I'm not sure if it was the right moment for the president to step in and say anything. And I think it brings into light questions about how the president reacts in the Middle East in general, and what are the messages that he puts forward. And you know, let's remember, one of the first things our president did was the Cairo speech, where he went and sent, I think, a very loud message about where he stands in issues in the Middle East.
Okay, I'll ask it differently. Were you uncomfortable that the President of the United States apologized for the fact that Americans apparently, unintentionally, burned a series of Korans?
I am uncomfortable because I know that whatever we do has consequences. And again, I wonder if there's a certain naivete in the U.S. about how things get perceived in the Middle East. So we may think we're apologizing and everything's going to be okay. And perhaps on the Middle Eastern side, it's going to be perceived as American weakness.
Okay, this is fascinating. What do you say?
I do have something to say. I'm glad you asked. First of all, you have to go back to Heinrich Heine, who said they'll start with the books, and he said it in 1821, they'll start with the books and they'll end with burning people. And in 1933, we saw that there was an encouragement by the Nazi government in Germany to get students to burn books, and it started. And I'm not really sure, I think you're half right, and I think everybody here is probably half right. I'm not sure if it was the president's place to bring attention to the fact that the Korans were burned. It should have been, there should have been some acknowledgement of it, because as a leader of the free world, America has a responsibility to say this is not the correct way to go. And we're backed up by history. We're backed up by Heinrich Heine. We're backed up by the facts that we saw in Germany before the war, before things got really bad. So I think there is a responsibility to say, we are culpable to some degree. I'm not sure who that messenger should have been.
Okay, so you think America should have said it. You're just not sure it should have been the President of the United States.
I think it was the right thing to do. I'm not sure the messenger was the correct messenger.
Okay, we're going to come back to it.
I find, Lynda, your analogy interesting, that you say they start with the burning of books and then eventually winds with the burning of people.
I wish it was mine, but it was Heine's. Yeah.
Fair enough. But what we saw here was the reaction to the burning of books was the murder of people by a bunch of very angry Afghans. Not just Americans, but when these riots get started, locals are often caught up in the crossfire. And I'm not one to coddle the president or the decisions he makes, but I think at worst he did perhaps the wrong thing for the right reasons. He was trying to restore some semblance of stability to the area, and I don't know how successful we're going to say he was.
There was no instability when he spoke.
When he spoke.
There was no instability.
But
one of the things is true. He made the issue public.
Right.
No one was no one was killing anybody. No one was rioting.
You shouldn't have weighed in on it.
So it's not that he tried to do this to calm things. The president felt that the people at the base where the books were burned had made a mistake and had burned the holy text of another people. Right. And he felt he should say, it was an accident, we're sorry.
It doesn't mean anything, by the way. Accidental burning of a Koran is as bad as burning of a Koran to a Muslim.
It seems to me, I'm a little surprised, it seems to me that if America does something to another person's sacred texts, for the president to say it was inadvertent and we're sorry was wholly appropriate. I don't understand why it bothered anybody. The response it evoked is a problem separate to me. And, but I'd like the president to speak out about that. I am more concerned that there has been sort of an administrative silence about the response that it evoked. But when it happened, I said, if it was an accident, in a country which we are basically occupying, the president says, we made a mistake, I'm sorry. And whenever you make a mistake, the appropriate thing to say is, I'm sorry, now let's move on. And I don't understand why anybody should have been upset by this.
Mark, I just wonder when whatever the president does, he's sending a signal. And for me, his silence sometimes is deafening. So, for example, when Iranians took to the streets in June of 2009 to protest what they believed were rigged elections of their president, and hundreds of thousands of Iranians took to the streets, put their personal lives at risk to do so, where was our president? So our president sometimes chooses to make statements and go out there and be supportive or be sorry or apologetic or whatever it may be, and sometimes he chooses to be completely silent. So I think we have to question when our president does what and for what reason.
Okay, that's a very sophisticated point. What does it suggest to you that this is where he wanted to be heard?
Well, I'll tell you what his silence on the Iran matter suggested
But we
me.
should make sure people know
Yes.
you have an Iranian background.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I do. So it's a very personal matter. I was born in Iran myself, and we fled as refugees in 1979 with the revolution in Iran and Khomeini. Came to the U.S. as political refugees, and one among many thousands of Jews who fled here. So when at that moment of June 2009, which I would posit was the beginning of the Arab Spring, when Iranians took to the streets to protest, I think we were at a historical moment where we could have just seen a change in the world that would, right now we could potentially not be speaking about a nuclear Iran today had things been different in June of 2009. So in June of 2009, we're in a historic moment where people took to the streets to protest, and the President of the United States chooses not to send a supportive message to those people, say, I am behind you. He chooses not to say to the regime in power, whose entire legitimacy is being questioned at that moment, he doesn't say to that regime, you're not a legitimate regime, and there are questions about your, being in power today and your entire, since '79 being in power. So that was a historic moment that was wasted, and I think that was a very loud and clear message that our president sent out about how he actually wants things to play out in the Middle East.
What does that mean, though? What do you think he wants to play out?
I have to wonder why the countries that are actual threats to the West and to Israel are those where we seem to lag in reaction. So Iran being an example, and Syria today. We're doing nothing about Syria. So it's questions. I can't say I have the answers. I'm not sure who really does have the answers. These issues are complicated. But I have to wonder why there are moments when we choose to be silent and moments when we choose to be apologetic.
What do you think?
I have a similar problem, but I must say that I remember very clearly that he did speak. He just didn't speak firmly enough. As he spoke about Syria, he didn't speak firmly
and
enough
after how many days?
Well, that's also important.
Right,
So it's
right,
an important
because the
question.
clock was ticking.
Right, I understand
the clock
that.
was ticking.
And
People's
the-
lives were at stake in the streets.
And it's questionable as
People who
whether-
were being beaten, murdered, who were going to
Again,
get
you've got
thrown
me in
in
a situation
jail.
where I'm defending the President of the United States, and I don't want to be in that position. I'm an equal opportunity critic.
Okay.
So I'm not a defender. I'm not as good at, right? But here's the point, though. Yes, the problem is that you just, as the President, you have to take a stand and you have a moral obligation to do things. You put certain pressure on. With the United States, they have a huge support structure. The problem in Syria today, let's say, for instance, is you just can't sort of help people. The Secretary of State said very clearly, if we help the rebels, we're helping then Al-Qaeda and we're helping Hamas, because those are the people who are really giving weapons. And that's the mistake that they made in Libya, because we gave weapons to Libya and it ended up going to Hamas. Iran doesn't give a squat about what the President of the United States says. The Ahmadinejad has no interest about, and will not be influenced by it.
But the people on the street, the people on the
That's true.
street
The people on the
care.
street, too.
The people on the street needed to know at that moment when they were putting their lives at stake whether the West, and specifically the United States of America, was
Yes.
behind them or
Okay,
not.
and I would go as far as-
and the
and
U.S.
I'm
was
interested
not.
in this only in terms of what does it say about how people today, as we are about to face a presidential election, feel about the President of the United States from a Jewish perspective. But I want to move it forward in another way. We had on Shalom TV an interview with Mayor Koch and with Alan Solow. Mayor Koch basically described how he supported a Republican candidate against an Orthodox Jewish Democratic candidate in the runoff election to replace Anthony Weiner,
Right.
because he wanted to send a message to the president. He felt the president had thrown Israel under the bus. He cited the incident at the March 2010 White House meeting when we all understand Obama disrespected and even humiliated Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that he wanted the president to know you can't take the Jewish vote for granted. Then we get Alan Solow, who is the outgoing chairman of the President's Conference, a major Democratic figure in Democratic politics and a personal friend and supporter of President Obama, but he was just the chairman of the President's Conference, who, while he was chairman, criticized the president publicly for his stand on opposing Jewish building in Jerusalem. And Ellen Solow sits where you're sitting, and he says to us, the event is a figment of imagination. It never happened the way it happened. Michael Oren was there, said it didn't happen. And understand that there was no disrespect, that we hear that the president left to have dinner with his family. The family wasn't even in Washington. According to Solow, the prime minister says to the president after a meeting on settlements, can we stay here and have some space in the White House to talk? The president says, sure, I'll go eat up in my private residence. If you want me, come back, call me, I'll come right back. They meet. Netanyahu sends a message, we'd like to continue the meeting. The president comes right back down. There's a cordial meeting. And he gives a very different description of the event. I say to Alan Solow, this is not a small thing. Many American Jews have been colored by this story, and we should know which story is right. Is your story right? Or is the story we have understood to be true correct? And if the story is, as you say it is, why has the Israeli Prime Minister not had said something, either himself or through his office, to sort of counter the popular narrative? And it seems to me that he has a responsibility, if it's true, to say something. And by the way, as Mike has already mentioned, they're about to meet again. This is the second year anniversary of that meeting. This would be a great time, and to clarify, and American Jews are about to partake in a presidential election.
Right.
And as a Jew, I want to know. I just want to know. And Micah, the hate mail I've gotten from that opinion piece that I did, where people said to me, Golub and Alan Solow will do anything and everything to cover for Obama, to cover from Obama, and covering Israel issue is appropriate for Shalom TV. Being an Obama apologist is not. I didn't see myself as an apologist for anything. This, to me, at the moment, reflects where American Jewry is. We tend to polarize and demonize one another. And I want to hear from the four of you. To what extent, number one, do you feel that the Jewish community has really now a beef with Obama because of the Cairo speech, because of his stand on settlements, because of his failure to protect the Iranian Revolution when there could have been an Iranian Revolution, and for other things? To what extent do you feel that in general, the Jewish community still is as liberally oriented as it tends to be, and that Obama is getting a bad rap in the Jewish community? And the issue that we started with is, why did he apologize? It's not because I'm pro-Obama. I just felt it was an appropriate thing for the president to do. And I am sensitive to the extent to which this is like a time bomb in the Jewish community. So, you have your own political perspective, but in general, Daniel, how do you view at the moment the American Jewish community's view of Barack Obama?
Well, it's definitely, I think, as you said, very, very polarized. You still have that liberal Jewish majority. I'm typically, reporting for the Orthodox community, where it's the exact opposite, and among the more hardcore supporters of Israel also. And part of it is the Cairo spiel, and this recent apology doesn't help. I see more opposition coming from the Republicans in general. Santorum coming out and saying, it's a sign of weakness, and I think it's one big sort of macho competition for certain people. That's how they see U.S. Middle East relations, as being who apologizes. It's like a big game of chicken to them, basically.
What do you think?
What do I think in general?
Yes.
I think there is a sea change going on in the Jewish world. I think there is a street decision being made about, are we going to vote for one of the large parties or the other of the large parties? Well, it seems that the Jews are perceived as a group that votes Democrat And I think the sea change is that they are contemplating how to vote Republican in a race that's the right race that has the wrong horses. And I think what's happening now is people have a little time to consider what's going to happen.
People are likely to believe it because it's in fitting with a trend. That's what it is. That people see this administration. I mean, look at Secretary of State Clinton. Last week she was in Tunisia, and people were asking, you know, what does your government, what are you going to do with your candidates being beholden to the Zionist lobbies or something to that effect? And she was very diplomatic. She said, well, you know, that lobby does not represent America, you know, and these kind of statements that are just sort of becoming thought of as, you know, typical of, again, the Obama administration, and so that's why the popular account, I think, retains its popularity. I would be curious to hear a first-hand account as well. You know, it would be nice if that came out in the meeting. But in the meantime, you know, the damage is done, and I don't think it's one event. I think it's just, you know, this ongoing sort of neglect of the U.S.-Israel relationship, you know, in terms of the settlements.
You've already expressed yourself, so that I know you at least have some problems with President Obama. But as number one, do you have a feeling as to whether, do you lean one way or the other about what probably happened in March of 2010? And in general, what is your sense of the Jewish community's relationship to Obama now?
I would venture to say that the American Jewish community still has more democratic leanings. And also, I would hate to hear about the entire Democratic Party being punished for the policies of the President of the United States. So just to share full disclosure, my brother-in-law, New York State Assemblyman Rory Landsman, is actually running for this very seat that you just mentioned, that a Republican won because of Ed Koch and people like that endorsing him and the punishing of the President for his Israel policies.
And your brother's part of which party?
He's a Democrat.
Okay.
He's a very staunchly pro-Israel Democrat. And so I think, you know, I would hate to see somebody like Rory be punished because of the president's policies. There are Democrats who are pro-Israel. Let's not forget that. So I would say, again, I think the natural leaning in the American Jewish community is definitely more liberal to democratic. And I think Israel is just one issue among many that people take into consideration when they think about their votes. So I'm not sure that we're going to be a voting bloc that's going to vote because of Israel.
Very interesting, Ellie. But how do you lean about the story?
Okay, so there's a gentleman who Alan Dershowitz is very angry with right now from
Yes.
Media Matters. Remind me his name.
His name is
Rosenberg.
Rosenberg, right.
Right.
MJ.
MJ Rosenberg. So I went on YouTube and found MJ Rosenberg speaking in front of an audience from Al Jazeera. And it was an Arab audience, it seemed like, and he was explaining the way this America works to this Arab audience. And in this Bantustan that we live in America, apparently the Jews control Congress, because the way that this gentleman was describing it, you know, if you step out of line and criticize Israel as a congressperson, the next day your funding will be cut. And I encourage everyone, go on YouTube, Google him, you'll find this piece right away. So one of the other interesting things he said, though, was he was describing how things are changing in America because of President Obama. And he was then using this story about what took place between President Obama and Bibi Netanyahu, and this specific story that you're referencing as an example of how Obama is now treating Israel just like any other country by kind of giving it a cold shoulder. So according to somebody with very close ties to the White House, it is in fact what took place.
Very interesting. When you mentioned the business about Rosenberg saying that if you go against Israel, you'll lose your funding if you're a congressman.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Absolutely not. I mean, this is the United States of America. This is insanity. I don't know how anybody could get up there and say such a thing.
There are many people, by the way, who believe that AIPAC runs everything in the whole world. And that even though AIPAC does not specifically give money to congressional or senatorial candidates or people who sit in Congress, there is this, you know, this Thomas Friedman idea that basically AIPAC buys for Netanyahu and Israel anything that they want. All right, so what do you say?
We have both sides of the aisle are lovers of Israel, and I want that to be absolutely clear. So we shouldn't say that this Republican or this Democrat or whatever the case may be Some people have more of an affinity and less of an affinity, but it has nothing to do with Republican and Democrat on this issue. But on the question as to whether or not the story actually happened, it's illustrative of so many different things, but especially of how a certain element within the Jewish community itself grabs onto things in order to get their message through. And from the communication point of view, the story as it's told serves an important cause, a hugely important cause, for the people to say, look, this president is an enemy, not an impartial observer, not an aide or an assistant or a helper of Israel. This is an enemy. Look how we treat. And that was really the message. In the bottom line, though, and I think it's hugely critical to see this, Israel has done nothing to correct the message on this, if it is not correct, if it is not the true story, because it fits right into what they want the talking points to be. It's important to see. They have a set of talking points they want also. And we'll see this now in the interaction between President of the United States and Prime Minister. There are back conversations that take place. Front conversations are less exciting. The back conversations, what's going on in the background, is that they're really setting up for a conflict. And not just about Iran, about the future of the Middle East, actually, what's going on, about what we're calling the Arab Spring. We have a completely different perception of between the White House and there. And Congress is being called to task on this, both sides of the aisle, as well as friends of the Prime Minister and friends of the President. And their friends, and everything else as they're aligning themselves.
You know, you have people like this Rosenberg talking about Israel firsters. You know, I talk to people my own age and younger than me, and Israel's a very important issue to them. They don't, I say Israel first. I think it's they're passionate.
But just make sure everyone understands.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When Rosenberg says that Jews tend to be Israel firsters, he's criticizing American Jews
yes.
for making Israel too much of a priority in, for example, a presidential election.
Right.
And that's one of the things that has made Alan Dershowitz, who you referred to, irate. And Dershowitz now is promising to basically launch his own campaign against Rosenberg, and he wants to undercut any kind of influence that Rosenberg has in the White House. So I just want to make sure everybody understands what you're referring to when you say Israel firsters.
All right, so I wish him the best of luck. But when I first heard that term come out, I have to admit I was somewhat conflicted, because when I talk to people who are active on the campuses and in Israel activism, I wouldn't say Israel firsters, because it suggests that there's a sort of disloyalty. It's more, I mean, if anything, they're liberty firsters or democracy firsters. But Israel happens to be something that they feel very passionately about. You know, I happen to have a thing for foreign policy, you know, and I look at that, you know, I don't concentrate on certain domestic issues, not because of a loyalty. It's just what speaks to me, what's interesting to me. It's not a division of loyalty. You know, these people are loyal to certain principles, and these are principles that they see being upheld in the United States and in Israel, and not so much in the countries surrounding Israel. So, you know, I would say that, you know, youth are becoming much more active now, and Israel is an important issue. I don't think it's a loyalty thing. You know, that canard goes back to well, you know, we're getting ready for Purim, and even back then they were saying there's a people that lives here, and they have their own set of laws, and that's what Haman said to Achashverosh, you know, the king said that they ignore your laws, they have their own way, and that's what they're saying now.
You have been involved your whole life, and certainly you and Marty gave so much of yourselves to everything having to do with Jewish and Israel. When you deal personally with the question of where does Israel rank for you, when, for example, you must determine whom you're going to vote for in a presidential election, to what extent is any worry or concern you have about Israel the number one concern?
Israel is always the number one concern.
It is, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed to tell anybody who asks me.
Does it make you a bad American?
It probably makes me a better Canadian. But
Are you an American citizen?
I am an American citizen.
So don't tell me about Canada.
A Canadian would say U.S. citizzen. Because Canada's part of America.
That's right. But I would say,
But you know what I'm asking. Yeah?
Yeah. I'm pretty unabashed about saying where I stand, because I think it's important. I think it's important for people who feel Israel is first to remind other Jews that if we don't have Israel, we don't have our lifeline that keeps us all together. So that for example, when I walked into the room today and I met all these people from different places and different backgrounds, there still were things in the small talk that we discussed that we were all tuned into. And that's because we have Israel. And the sooner we understand that Israel is our lifeline, the better off we all will be. And it was something that was instilled into me as a child of Holocaust survivors who went to Israel in 1950 from communist Poland. And they knew this is going to save us, because the way we were living in the old country, just yearning for the country isn't enough. We have a yearning. It's what we do. We're Jews. We yearn for Zion. We yearn for it. But having the reality of the state of Israel helps. It helps save us, protect us. So yes, Israel is very important to me. And I will vote based on where my candidate feels Israel belongs in that pecking order.
How do you answer the same question, Ellie, when you think about who you're going to vote for? Where does the issue of Israel rank for you?
Well, as someone who also fled a country in my own lifetime, a country where my ancestry goes back thousands of years to the pre-Islamic period, I fully have experienced personally how important it is to have a homeland, somewhere that we could go to if we needed.
Right.
So securing Israel is obviously very important to me personally. And in general, I'd have to say I'm not terribly pleased with the way this country is being run right now and where we're headed. So those are all issues that I will be considering when I vote.
Very good. Where does it rank for you?
Where does Israel rank?
Yeah.
For me, it's number one.
Okay. How about for you?
It's an interesting question. As I'm listening to a guest's answer, I am also an Israeli. I was not born in Israel. I chose to live in Israel, and which is an important issue also. So it wasn't because I fled the oppressive United States. I chose to make Aliyah, which is an important element. And my life right now has brought me back to the United States. That being said, Israel is hugely important in my analysis. Not just for Israel's sake, but for the United States' sake also, and for the issue of democracy and the development of democracy, but also in terms of friendships, in terms of real, secure allies. And it's important to be able to build that on a geopolitical level, because honestly and truly, aside from a handful of people in the United States, the religious link to Israel is only one component. I'm not speaking about the Jewish question, I'm speaking in general. The connection to Israel is a shared connection to many, many things. So for me, it is very, very important, there's no question about it. As to whether or not it is the linchpin or the element which sways me one side or another has to do with a much more nuanced idea. There's no candidate that will run for president of the United States in a serious way without a positive stance on Israel. Because Democrats are pro-Israel and Republicans are pro-Israel. There's no doubt about it. Ron Paul is the exception.
Do you agree with
I
him?
agree that when we're in an election cycle, everyone tries to be as supportive as they can be at that moment for Israel. Yes, I do.
But even within Israel, you have disputing points. So the advisors to the president will say, I'm just echoing what's going on in this section of Israel. Why do you think that that's? And they'll say that to countervailing forces within that they're discussing within the White House itself.
Okay, but I'm not telling anybody at this table something they haven't heard. Mm-hmm. That when you hear now American Jews discuss the upcoming presidential election, very often you will hear them say, how can you vote for President Obama given his stand on Israel? And what you'll hear is people say that there's a concern on the right that Obama is not pro-Israel enough. It's what you've basically said in a soft way. And that therefore this is going to drive their presidential decision, their presidential vote.
It was interesting. At the beginning of the election cycle last time, 4 years ago, exactly now, at this point in time, McCain and the Republican Party had a Jewish, serious chunk of people that were going to be voting for him on the Israel question. And they did. And then we saw the Jewish vote whittle away until eventually became exactly where it's always been. Not always been.
It was higher. It was slightly higher.
Traditionally, right. And so there was a period of time where, just in one major election, where the Jewish community voted a little bit less for Democrats. But in general, it fit right into the same sweet spot. In general, that's what we're talking about here. The reality is, though, that once again, earlier on in the election cycle, we saw Jews moving away on this question. The reality is, as I see it, is that Democrats and Republicans alike have a love for Israel. The Ron Paul exception is an exception which is based on libertarianism and is based on something which is dramatically different. It's not a hater of Israel. The fact that other people embrace his ideas who are haters of Israel is a different story. But he's not a serious Democrat. He's not a serious contender here.
I want to express a thought. I want you to tell me whether you think I'm being romantic or not, or whether it's legitimate. in my mind, one of the things that characterizes this nation is its commitment, as we've said, both to democracy and to liberty and to a regard for minorities. And for me, it's inconceivable that America, if it's going to be true to itself, would not want to ensure the well-being and the survival of the State of Israel. And that therefore, I do accept the notion that a president who supports Israel is doing so in a way that reflects a broader philosophy that I want for America. And every now and then somebody will say to me, well, can you imagine a president who would be very strong on Israel, but would appoint Supreme Court justices who would undercut all of the social values that American Jews hold dear? Yes, I can imagine it. But the reality is that the Supreme Court changes and evolves, and very often people come in as ideologues and find some other middle ground. And my sense is that I believe that if one says Israel first, it is almost unfair. Because what you're really saying is I have a vision of America in which the best of America is always going to be supportive of Israel, and therefore a president who reflects that vision is going to be good for the President of the United States. I ask you specifically, am I being romantic?
You are being romantic, but you're not totally wrong. You are extremely correct in this. Here's the problem with it. If you were to speak to the President of the United States or to his wife on this very question, they would be insulted that they would be categorized as hating Israel.
Or anti-Israel.
Or as hating, or anti-Israel, or in any way, shape, or form insulted, because in their eyes, that's not the case. And this is very important for the viewers to understand this. Now, and once again, I'm in the position where I'm explaining the point of view of the President. I'm a better critic than I am a defender. In this particular case, we have to understand it's a different orientation in terms of the way in which they affect and appreciate their care. They believe in a total image of equality, and it's raising the playing field so that everyone is on the same level. And so what happens, it's a altering conception from the point of view of lovers of Israel, because there's a special relationship between Israel and the United States. And when you level the playing field, that special relationship is altered. Now, this is very, very important in conceptual terms, because the conceptual term says, in other words, your best friend gets hurt because what's happening, that doesn't make them any less your best friend. And this is the point of view of the President. Now, again,
you're not advocating,
I don't want
you're
to explain.
explaining.
I'm trying to explain this. And so that's where your insight is good and appropriate, but it doesn't take away any more of the pain. It doesn't make it hurt less. It still hurts a lot. And for lovers of Israel, and the Jewish community that loves Israel, and the non-Jewish community that really loves Israel, which is actually a bigger community than the Jewish community that loves Israel, and we can talk about that in another way. The pain that they feel by this evening of the playing field is almost a stab in the back. And as a result, these other images that we've been talking about in the course of our hour together come into focus much clearer. So I don't think there are a lot of people that would look out and say, oh, the President is an anti-Semite. Because it was hard to believe that the United States would have a president. But they would say that he's not working in tandem with the steps that we would imagine a lover of Israel to be walking in. And that's where the pain really happens, because the gestalt, the worldview, is so dramatically different, because primary in the President's eyes is equal opportunity and the raising or the leveling of the playing field. That's with regard to everyone, including the Iranians, including the Palestinians, including everyone across the board. But we've seen a lot of mistakes in that. Because the mistake, let's say, in Libya, trying to create equality in Libya is creating a civil war. In Egypt, we have an election there where the Islamic fundamentalists are literally taking over a potential parliament. So we have problems with that gestalt.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about the leveling of the playing field, because Americans and Jews immediately feel good about that idea in principle.
Yeah.
The problem is that what the President is doing is not really leveling the playing field. When you try to equate Israel to the Palestinians, you have one group with such a different attitude towards the conflict than the other, that you have elevated the Palestinian, I'm sure everybody at this table doesn't wish ill to anybody. But I don't want to give an advantage to people who want to kill the state of Israel and kill the Jewish people. And part of what I think the president doesn't understand, I don't know why, is that it's not simply two children who need to be sort of each one grabbed by the ear and pulled to a table. You've got one people who are already at the table, and other people who are saying they want to blow the table up. And the president wants to make those two level the playing field with those two.
The president really believes, as does his wife, the First Lady, as do the people around him, that if he only had the opportunity to speak to the people in the right way, he would convince them.
Yes.
And that's
the romantic.
That's the romance.
Yes.
And that they just haven't been able to get into the room with him and get him to be to convince them. And that's part of the romance. And it's naive and it's mistaken, but it's not because of lack of desire to get it done. He wants to
or
do
an
that.
animus towards Jews or Israel.
Not at all.
Yes.
It's a misguided understanding of his own power. And when you read the new biography of Michelle Obama, you actually see that coming out. The frustration that the president just didn't have the ability to get there and talk to people to get it done. Because if you could only convince them, then thousands of years of history would obviously just flow by the side, and all this would be resolved because of a charismatic and dynamic personality.
Another issue. We're in this Republican primary season. And of late, the issue has been raised primarily by Rick Santorum, but not simply by him, that social values should be a major concern of the electorate when they go to the polls, and that, in general, he is representing a fairly adamant Christian position as he runs for President of the United States. You will see on American media the suggestion that there is a secular war against religion in general in America, and more specifically, some kind of war against Catholicism, especially, the Republicans would argue, waged by the current administration, the Democratic Party, and the President of the United States. As somebody who comes from Iran, and you come to a country here, how old were you? You were a child, were you not?
I don't like to talk about age.
Okay,
yes, I was very young.
Okay, that's
First
all.
grade.
Okay. And here you now have grown up in a system where there is a constitutional separation between church and state.
Yes.
Do you have for yourself a philosophy about where you feel is appropriate for the government to cross that line? Is there any place that you would say it is important for the interests of the state that the government has a right to tell a religious organization there's a behavior that is either acceptable or unacceptable? How do you for yourself philosophize about the issue? Where would you draw the line protecting church-state separation and the free exercise of religion?
Look, I think all people are looking for lives of meaning, all of us. And so when you talk about social values, that's another way of saying meaning. And to have a national conversation about social values and what we stand for and what we want for ourselves and our children and living a life of meaning, I think it's important, and there's no reason not to have a conversation about that. Chances are we're not all going to agree about what those values are and what we want for ourselves. But I think having a conversation is natural and healthy and should be encouraged. In terms of church-state separation, I understand, I think that we as Jews and the history that we carry, we have a knee-jerk reaction to wanting to keep very clear, clean, separate church-state separation because we're worried, what's going to be just around the corner if we don't keep things separate. At the same time, I think that we're living in a country that is welcoming to us and is multicultural and diverse, and I don't know if we need to be worried so much anymore.
What do you think?
Well, I don't think that spiritual matters should be banished from the public sphere. I think there's a difference between separating church and state and taking God out of the equation entirely. I think he belongs in public discourse, but it shouldn't be a driving force behind policy. Social issues are important because, one rabbi once told me that the law is a teacher. People get an understanding of what's what's acceptable conduct based on what the laws of the country are. Now, it's funny, Rick Santorum came out the other week and he's taken a lot of flack for basically belittling JFK's speech, a fellow Catholic, right? When he came out and said, I believe there should be a division between church and state, and he said, yeah, it makes me want to vomit. And I thought to myself, well, what an amazing coincidence, Mr. Santorum.
Coincidence in what sense?
Oh, in that hearing him say that made me feel a little... But in all seriousness, I like I said, I don't think that spirituality should be taken out of public life. I think the importance of the separation of church and state is that no particular faith tradition or lack thereof is forced upon the people. That should be the main focus. And I agree with you. I think we do obsess on matters of religion and race, and especially like when people make such a fuss. We elected our first black president. I think this is a sign we're over racism. I think we'll be over racism when nobody cares what color the candidate is.
And I
It
think,
shouldn't
I
be a
think the
factor.
lesson is that today we don't really care so much that he's black.
Right. But when he was elected,
Right.
it was a driving force.
Right.
Although, I talk to a lot of Jews who think that anybody who's anti-Obama is doing it because they're racist.
Interesting. Interesting.
Okay, I want to test you.
Oh.
Should a city have the right to ban the use of public schools on the weekends from being used by church or synagogue groups? Micah?
Oh, well, it depends on how you read the law, fundamentally. The answer...
I just wonder what you want.
Oh, what I want?
Yeah, what you want.
I would like the city to make money on that, especially if it goes to the education of
Does
the...
it bother you at all if a
Not in the
public...
least.
Not in the least. Does it bother you at all?
Not at least.
Not in the least. Does it bother you at all?
Not at all.
Not at all. Does it bother you at all?
Couldn't care
So
less.
why at the moment is New York City banning the use of the Christians' use, well, it's churches. The Baptist church that was using a public school on the weekends when the school isn't being used. And the argument was made, it may give the appearance that the state is endorsing a specific religion.
I think it's oversensitive.
The city was wrong to make that decision.
Should a moment of private prayer at the beginning of school, in a public school, be permitted?
I have nothing against it. I think if it's an optional exercise, for me, the Pledge of Allegiance under God, I said that every day for so many years, and as I learned what it meant and it sunk in, like I personally don't have a problem with it. People can stand there, not say anything if they want. As for prayer in public school, I think it's a little weird that
Silent prayer.
Silent prayer, right? Well, in general, how about going back to the church on Sundays being held in school? It was people hear it's such a knee-jerk reaction. No prayer in public school. What it means is no prayer as like a forced part of the curriculum, but people take it no prayer ever, and I don't think that was what was originally intended.
Silent prayer at the beginning of a public school day. Bother you?
I think a moment of meditation is always a good thing.
Yes, I didn't use the word meditation.
I did.
I know.
I did.
Does that mean you would be offended if the word prayer were used?
I don't think so. I think it's okay.
Okay, a moment of personal silent prayer in public schools before school begins.
I think it's wonderful. It's a good way to start the day by reflecting.
Look, I'm the wrong person to ask you these questions.
Why are you wrong?
Well, because fundamentally,
You're interesting.
Right. Fundamentally, I actually believe in prayer. I absolutely believe in prayer, and I think we should teach about prayer. I think we should teach about God also. The question is really...
Public schools, though?
Yes. I
The
don't think we should
public
be...
schools should talk about to teach
We
God?
should talk about God. Now, that's it's
Who
a problem.
should talk about God in
We
public
should-
schools?
We can't learn Shakespeare without reading these things. You can't learn...
Who should
you
talk
can-
about God? Should it be
it's-
Mark
it's-
Golub?
I don't know. What I do know
Should it be somebody from the Chabad?
What I do know, no.
Who should
no,
talk
no, no,
about
no.
God?
There
But,
should be
I mean,
courses on Bible. They
Micah.
should learn Bible. They should learn Koran. They should learn about different conceptions.
That's not talking about God.
That is, of
No,
course
it
it's
is not. No, that's talking about religious literature. You want somebody to come in and talk about God?
No, I want people to learn about books that were essential in the faith traditions across the board. I want them to learn about that. And I don't think we should be embarrassed or ashamed of it. So that's why I'm the wrong person to ask this. I don't think that neutering our tradition is very positive, and that's
Well,
what we do.
You found a way that I would say no to. But what about a moment of silent prayer?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it, fundamentally. I don't have a problem. As long as no one's telling me that I have to do it, or no one's telling me what kind of silence it has to be. If my silence is tapping my finger, then that should be okay also.
Okay.
It doesn't even have to be silent.
We all agree. Okay, last. There is a video on YouTube put out by the President of the United States in which he is saying that he is announcing the launch, 2012 launch, of an African Americans for Obama campaign. And one of the things he wants is people in their faith community to go to work to obviously get out the vote for him. Is it appropriate for the President of the United States to ask faith communities to be involved in political campaigns?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because
Why is it that where the line is drawn?
Well, because fundamentally we have to realize something, and this is the element. This goes back to the question of the war on religion. We are a country filled with people who have faith and filled with a culture which is based around faith.
No question.
And so we need to embrace that. If we don't, then what we've done is bifurcated the society and created those people who have and those people who don't, where most people are somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Because people are questioning, and it's important for us to do this. So I'm not ashamed or afraid that the president has one particular angle, and he happens to have that angle and should utilize that angle. He has a group of people who both connect to him, both religiously and culturally, and he could say to them, please help me out. What's wrong with saying that?
Do you think that synagogues and churches should be campaigning for a candidate?
Or one side or the other. The big question, though, is whether or not they can get tax-exempt status.
Well, they do
That's a
have
difference.
tax-exempt status.
No, I said whether they can, not whether
Do you want to take away their tax-exempt
That's a
status?
different issue.
It's the issue I'm asking
Okay,
you.
if a synagogue or church step into the question of politics, then they are ultimately stepping in the dangerous tax-exempt status.
But would you like to see the code change? Right now, what people should understand is the IRS code for 501Cs, church nonprofits.
Yes.
They lose their nonprofit status if they engage in political activity.
Correct.
You're endorsing churches to be involved
Yes.
in activity. Do you think the code should be changed?
Yes.
So that they would not lose their tax
Correct.
status?
That's
What do you
exactly
say?
what I said.
Mark, I worked on 2 political campaigns.
Which two?
Well, one for Rory Lansman for state senate and for Betsy Gottbaum's run for public advocate.
Okay.
And so what was interesting to me in the state senate race was that Rory is Jewish, and we were running against an Italian American on the other side. And the Italian American community rallied, and they were so proud of their candidate, and that was their identification. When we sat down with Jews and said, vote for Rory because he's Jewish, I mean, you can't even have that conversation. Jews aren't interested in voting for somebody because they're Jewish. So, for me, it's just an interesting lesson.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, in
We're
how
crazy.
other,
We are crazy.
Yeah, it's very, other ethnicities and minorities in this country are willing to rally around each other and support each other, and as Jews, we don't do that.
It's funny you mention that because my paper was actually involved in the Turner campaign. Sorry about that. No, I'm not sorry. But when we expressed our support, some of the larger papers started saying, oh, local Jewish paper crosses religious lines to support, non-Jewish candidates, as if it was some kind of big deal. But to us, it was a matter of it's whoever we feel is better for the job, whoever we feel is espousing the right viewpoints. And for me, being Jewish is like a tiebreaker. If you have 2 people for a job and they're offering the same thing at the same price, the same quality, if one is Jewish, I go with the Landsman. Sorry, but if one is expressing something that I appreciate more, that's not a determining factor, So there's 2 ways to look at it. Either we're not hung up on matters of Jewishness, we're looking for the right person, or is it that we have a lack of solidarity? I like to think more of the former.
I want to make sure I understand you. There's a non-Jew who's applying for a job.
Yes.
You read the qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
They're a touch more qualified than the Jew.
Mm-hmm.
You give the job to the non-Jew?
To the more qualified, personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of the publication. That's
you,
me.
That's you. Okay. What would you do?
Give the job to the more qualified. I think
He's
I
only
have
slightly
been.
more qualified.
Yeah, I think I have been
How interesting.
conditioned.
What do you
yeah.
give it to?
And this is a business hire that we're talking about? Someone who I'm hiring? Yeah?
Yeah, you're hiring somebody. I said just a little more qualified.
It's very
What
tough.
do you do?
Look, the reality is that if you don't, then you're discriminating. You can't do that.
What do you mean
That's
you're discriminating?
If you hire a Jew because they're Jewish, you're discriminating against the person who's better qualified. That's the nature of the beast. So you have a problem. So I'm not going to
So
publicly
I'm the
assume-
only one who would hire the Jew.
I didn't say that. What I'm saying is that recognizing or identifying the fact that that you're making decisions based on a prejudice and not on something else.
Oh, I don't consider it prejudice.
Prejudice can be a positive thing also. It doesn't
Yeah,
necessarily have
yes,
to be a negative one.
yes.
So,
Although the word prejudice
is
tends
only
to-
interpreted
right.
that way.
Yes,
But the prejudice
yes,
is that you
but
move
it also
towards
has to do with how comfortable I'm going to be with working with this individual.
That's already a different issue then.
No, but this
the
part,
comfort level
I
is
said, who are you going to hire? But wait, if
Comfort
there
level is
is a very qualified person and a very unqualified person, it's not interesting to me. It's just like this. I'm going to give it to the Jew. It's not, and by the way, I don't believe you.
There are other factors, you know. There
Aren't there?
Yeah, like you
I mean,
said.
it comes to what because my point is, although I think it's true that Jews don't ever want to say, many Jews, by the way, will have the exact reverse. They will not
Yes,
hire
the
the Jew.
opposite.
Right.
They will not vote for the Jew.
Right.
Okay. There are still people, and I count you as one of them, who, if you love the Jewish people and you care about the Jewish people and you care about the well-being of our people, there is almost a mitzvah sense that one has an obligation to first take care when you can of fellow Jews. And this is not to hurt anybody else.
Well-
But the reality also is there's an enormous world out there. We've heard this. An enormous world. There are millions of people helping millions of people. Very many people don't help Jews. Jews have to help Jews. Don't we? Don't we have to help
Yeah.
each other?
Yeah, we do.
That's something that resonates with you.
Oh, of course.
I think it's an identity question.
Yes.
The Italian Americans are proud of that identity, and they're willing to rally around their candidate.
Yes, that's
and
correct.
I'm not sure if Jewish Americans feel the same way about that identity.
Yes. Although I'm wondering whether that's really the terminology you want to use.
Yes, it's not apples to apples.
Just a minute.
Yeah.
There are Italian Americans.
Okay.
What's the equivalent for us?
I hear you. I mean,
What is the equivalent?
It's a great question.
I don't know. Are we Ashkenazi
No, no, no.
American?
American
no.
Jew or Jewish American?
Yes, I don't. By the way, I never call myself a Jewish American.
Oh, that's
It never occurs to me. I am an American Jew. They are Italian Americans. And by the way, there is something profound in that distinction. And I'm not belittling it. I almost envy it. They are Irish Americans and Italian
Yes.
Americans. We are not Jewish Americans. We are American Jews. Now, there are some Jews who are not American Jews. They are Jewish Americans. But I don't believe any of us at this table are Jewish Americans. I would be American Jews. Do you
Yeah.
think I'm wrong?
No, I think you're spot on a lot of different issues, but especially on this issue. I think you're absolutely correct. Not just distinguishing between the Jewish community and the other ethnic communities in the United States, but also recognizing a huge distinction between who we are as a people and the society and what drives us, which is dramatically different. Some of those divisions that drive us ultimately prevent us from joining together like you would like, Ellie. But on the other hand, it also shows a remarkable wealth and excitement and dynamic that the other communities have, but in a far different way. And so that's what we see in your description. I appreciate it very much.
I have to bring this to a close. I'm so sorry. I love talking to the four of you. I hope you will come back often. Lynda, it's wonderful to be with you. Daniel, it's a pleasure to have met you. Ellie, you're terrific. You're my favorite. You come all the time. And you've said a lot of things that will make our audience think, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And those are the thoughts of Micah Halpern, Ellie Cohanim, Lynda Kraar, and Daniel Perez. And you can read Daniel at his website, jewishvoiceny.com. It is wonderful that I had all of them to talk to us on this roundtable. And again, I hope you enjoyed hearing all of them. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to some of the things you heard discussed here. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.